When Franklin Roosevelt took office on March 4th, 1933, the banking system of the United States was on the verge of collapse. That delay between the election of 1932 in the fall and the inauguration on the 4th of March was clearly too long, which is why in 1933 the country also adopted the 20th Amendment, which moved the inaugural date for presidents back from March the 4th, where it had always been, to January 20th, to shorten that gap in case the country was ever in an emergency like this again. Roosevelt's inaugural address is one of the best speeches ever given in the history of the United States, and the country began to psychologically turn the corner. But at the time of his inauguration, banks had already begun experiencing runs on the banks, in which people tried to take all of their money out at once. So, on March the 5th, the day after he was inaugurated, Roosevelt immediately closed all the banks for a national banking holiday. He called Congress into emergency session, and on March 9th, the Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. This act allowed the Federal Reserve to provide enough money to the banks to keep them open, to ensure that they had enough paper money on hand to meet all their needs. Then, on March the 12th, FDR sat down and he gave a radio address to the country, and he called it a fireside chat. It was like the president was sitting in your living room talking to you over the radio, like he was right there. And so in the first of his fireside chats on March the 12th, he calmly explained to the American people what had been done with the banks, why the emergency had occurred, and what was going to happen the next day when the banks began reopening. On March 13th, the banks began reopening, and the runs on the banks had stopped. Franklin Roosevelt literally saved the remaining banks in just the first few days after his presidency began.
President Hoover, Mr. Chief Justice, my friends, this is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days. In such a spirit on my part and on yours, we face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. Values have shrunk to fantastic levels, taxes have risen, our ability to pay has fallen, government of all kinds is faced by serious curtailment of income, The means of exchange are frozen in the currents of trade. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no markets for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. And yet our distress comes from no failure of substance. We are stricken by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered because they believed and were not afraid, we have still much to be thankful for. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. Primarily, this is because the rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure and have abdicated. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. True, they have tried, but their efforts have been cast in the pattern of an outworn tradition. Faced by failure of credit, they have proposed only the lending of more money. Stripped of the lure of profit by which to induce our people to follow their false leadership, they have resorted to exhortations, pleading tearfully for restored confidence. They only know the rules of a generation of self-seekers. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of that restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values, more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy, the moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profit. These dark days, my friends, will be worth all they cost us if they teach us that our true destiny is not to be ministered unto, but to minister to ourselves, to our fellow men. Recognition of that falsity of material wealth as the standard of success goes hand in hand with the abandonment of the false belief that public office and high political position are to be valued only by the standards of pride of place and personal profits, and there must be an end to a conduct in banking and in business which too often has given to a sacred trust the likeness of callous and selfish wrongdoing. Small wonder that confidence languishes, for it thrives only on honesty, on honor, on the sacredness of obligations, on faithful protection, and on unselfish performance. Without them, it cannot live. Restoration calls, however, not for changes in ethics alone. This nation is asking for action, and action now. Our our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our great natural resources. Hand in hand with that, we must frankly recognize the overbalance of population in our industrial centers, and by engaging on a national scale in a redistribution endeavor to provide a better use of the land for those best fitted for the land. Yes, the task can be helped by definite efforts to raise the values of agricultural products, and with this the power to purchase the output of our cities. It can be helped by preventing realistically the tragedy of the growing loss through foreclosure of our small homes and our farms. It can be helped by insistence that the federal, the state, and the local governments act forthwith on the demand that their cost be drastically reduced. It can be helped by the unifying of relief activities which today are often scattered, uneconomical, unequal. It can be helped by national planning for and supervision of all forms of transportation and of communications and other utilities that have a definitely public character. There are many ways in which it can be helped, but it can never be helped by merely talking about it. We must act quickly. And finally, in our progress towards a resumption of work, we require two safeguards against a return of the evils of the old order. There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credits and investments. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money. And there must be provision for an adequate but sound currency. These, my friends, are the lines of attack. I shall presently urge upon a new Congress in special session detailed measures for their fulfillment, and I shall seek the immediate assistance of the 48 states. Through this program of action, we address ourselves to putting our own national house in order and making income balance outgo. Our international trade relations, though vastly important, are in point of time and necessity secondary to the establishment of a sound national economy. I favor, as a practical policy, the putting of first things first. I shall spare no effort to restore world trade by international economic readjustment, but the emergency at home cannot wait on that accomplishment. The basic thought that guides these specific means of national recovery is not narrowly nationalistic. It is the insistence as a first consideration upon the interdependence of the various elements in and parts of the United States of America, a recognition of the old and permanently important manifestation of the American spirit of the pioneer. It is the way to recovery. It is the immediate way. It is the strongest assurance that recovery will endure. In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor. The neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others. The neighbor who respects his obligations and respects the sanctity of his agreement in and with a world of neighbors. If I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other. We cannot merely take, but we must give as well. That if we are to go forward, we must move as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline. Because without such discipline, no can be made, no leadership becomes effective. We are, I know, ready and willing to submit our lives and our property to such discipline because it makes possible a leadership which aims at the larger good. I propose to offer, pledging that the larger purposes will bind upon us all, as a sacred obligation, with a unity of duty hitherto evoked only in times of armed strife. With this pledge, I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people, dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems. Action in this image, action to this end, is feasible under the form of government which from our ancestors. Our Constitution is so simple, so practical, that it is possible always to meet extraordinary needs by changes in emphasis and arrangement without loss of essential form. That is why our Constitution has proved itself the most superbly enduring political mechanism the modern world has ever seen. It has met every stress of vast expansion of territory, of foreign wars, of bitter internal strife, of world relations. It is to be hoped that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be wholly equal, wholly adequate to meet the unprecedented task before us. But it may be that an unprecedented demand and need delayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. For the trust reposed in me, I will return the courage and the devotion that befit the time. I can do no less. We face the arduous days that lie before us in the warm courage of national unity, with the clear consciousness of seeking old and precious moral values with the clean satisfaction that comes from the stern performance of duty by old and young alike, we assurance of a rounded, a permanent national life. We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their will. In the spirit of the gift, I take it. In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask the blessing of God. May He protect each and every one of us. May He guide me in the days to come.
Here is FDR sitting in front of a bank of microphones giving his first fireside chat. You can see there are only two nationwide radio networks, NBC and CBS. FDR termed his program the New Deal. His cousin Teddy Roosevelt had instituted a fair deal for American workers, and now Franklin Roosevelt had a New Deal for Americans. In Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, he signed a flurry of legislation, 13 major bills in all, aimed at getting the country back on its feet. And those major bills included the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA, and finally, the most lasting of all the reforms of the first 100 days, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority I want to focus on for a moment. We'll come back to those other agencies in time. The Tennessee Valley Authority was meant to build dams, create hydroelectricity, and control flooding in the region of the Tennessee Valley. You can see the region of the Tennessee Valley Authority there on the map on the slide. And the TVA eventually, by building dams and creating hydroelectricity, you're creating jobs, you're bringing electricity to a lot of these rural areas. And there were smaller versions of the TVA that were enacted eventually all over the country. Here in North Texas, we have the Trinity River Valley Authority, or TRVA. And so these regional controls, regional plannings for waterways were the most lasting of the legislation of the first 100 days. The New Deal had 3 R's to it: recovery, relief, and reform. One of the first pieces of legislation that got passed during the 100 days was actually the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. And in order to understand the importance of this act, we have to go back to the Pecora hearings. Ferdinand Pecora was a young Italian prosecutor from New York who was tasked by the U.S. Senate to look into the causes of the Great Depression. And Pecora held hearings, and in these hearings, Pecora revealed that it was the bankers who had acted irresponsibly. It was the bankers who had brought a great deal of the calamity on their own banks. And bankers had been the captains of industry in the 1920s. They had been national heroes. And in 6 weeks in the Pecora hearings, bankers went from being heroes to being referred to as banksters. Gangsters with banks. Banksters. I like that term a great deal. But anyway, So the Glass-Steagall Banking Act was passed. It had been proposed and defeated several times before in Congress, but finally it passed in 1933. And the Glass-Steagall Act did several things. First of all, it segregated commercial from investment banking. Commercial banking is very boring. It's where banks handle mortgages, they handle car loans, they handle savings accounts, they handle checking accounts. It's boring. There's a small rate of return, but it's stable. Investment banking, on the other hand, is where banks take your money and they gamble with it in the stock market. The problem is that when you mix commercial and investment banking under the same roof, it creates a great deal of risk, so that if the bank loses its investments, say in a stock market crash like the one that occurred in 1929, then all of a sudden all of the commercial assets of the bank are at risk as well. And so the Glass-Steagall Banking Act put down an absolute barrier between commercial banking and investment banking. It said if you're a commercial bank, you cannot engage in investment banking, and if you're an investment bank, you cannot engage in commercial banking. This is very important. It kept American banks small, it broke them up, and it kept them mostly safe for the next 66 years. In 1999, the Republican Congress, along with President Clinton, repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, and 10 years later we had the Great Recession, when once again the banks failed because they had gotten too big. Commercial banks had begun engaging in investment banking again. So, to this day, the Congress still has not reinstituted the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. One of the other things that the Glass-Steagall Act did was it created the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Securities and Exchange Commission, of course, was meant to police the stock market. And the first head of the SEC, or the Securities Exchange Commission, was actually Joseph Kennedy Sr., a man who had made his money in the stock market largely by cheating others in the stock market. FDR, though, sensed that Joe Kennedy Sr. needed a change, and in fact he did. He was interested in building a legacy at that point. And so Kennedy took and made illegal all the practices that had made him wealthy. When he got done writing the rules of the first SEC, Kennedy said even he couldn't make a nickel in the stock market anymore. So that's the Glass-Steagall Act, the Pecora hearings. As far as recovering some of the other legislation passed in the first 100 days, the National Recovery Administration, which was aimed at helping industry write fair codes of cooperation to limit production. Ultimately, of course, the NIRA was ruled unconstitutional in 1935, but you were only supposed to do businesses with those businesses that displayed the NRA's Blue Eagle in their windows. Never did fully work, though, because you couldn't get the industrial businesses to write fair codes of cooperation with each other. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA, was another major piece of legislation. The AAA tried to get farmers to limit their production voluntarily again, but again the AAA was ruled unconstitutional and largely failed, just for the same reason the NIRA had failed, that they could not get farmers to cooperate with each other voluntarily. The idea was behind the AAA was you actually had farmers that year in 1933, they were going to pay them to plow under their crops. Well, paying them to plow under their crops works if you have your own independent farm. However, if you are a sharecropper, what ends up happening is that the landowner who owns your land plows under your crops and you're deprived of a living. That's what this cartoon here on the right is depicting. Federal farm relief as applied to the South. You can see the white South putting the squeeze on sharecroppers and tenants by plowing under their crops. So the AAA did not take into account sharecroppers and tenants. A lot of New Deal legislation was fundamentally racist in the sense that it excluded African Americans. And the reason was that FDR needed the votes of Southern congressmen and senators to get his agenda passed. And so, as a result, for instance, when they passed the Social Security Act of 1935 during the Second New Deal, domestic workers were excluded from Social Security because most domestic workers in the South were African American. So you have these things within the New Deal where people were excluded, and it was because of the politics that FDR needed those white Southern congressmen and senators to vote with him. He didn't agree with them, but he was willing to compromise with them. Within the Roosevelt administration, there were fundamentally two schools of thought as to how to get relief to the American people. One school, championed by Harry Hopkins, who had come with FDR from New York State, was to directly give money to people. And the other approach, of course, was to put people to work with jobs so they could earn the money. That latter approach was championed by the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. And Ickes and Hopkins often clashed about how best to use the money that Congress was voting out for relief. Well, on May 12, 1933, Congress voted out $500 million for direct relief to families. And Hopkins used the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to begin handing out money. By the end of 1933, Hopkins had given money directly to 15% of American families. Some of the other agencies created by the New Deal included the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, the Civil Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, which was actually part of the Second New Deal, and the National Youth Administration. The Civilian Conservation Corps actually took young people whose families were on relief in the cities and put them to work preserving and restoring our national parks as well as state parks. They lived in tents. Most of the money they earned actually went back to their families that were on relief. These Triple C camps were actually administered by the military. And the brilliant thing about the Triple C, which I think is probably one of the best portions of the New Deal, was that with the Triple C, when World War II broke out, we had a ready-made army. All of these young men who'd been living in these camps working on these projects. They were already used to military discipline, military life, everything except for, of course, handling weapons. Meanwhile, the Public Works Administration and the Civil Works Administration were overseen by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, you see there on the right. And these organizations were designed to build large building projects. Sometimes the building projects took time to get underway, but dams, buildings, stadiums, high schools, just a plethora of different large building projects. You can look on the link to see all the New Deal projects that were built in Texas, if you see the link that I sent out to the class. Now, the Works Progress Administration was actually part of the Second New Deal, and I'm going to get to it later. There's actually two New Deals, one in 1933 and one in 1935. The one in 1933 was fundamentally much more conservative in its approach and how it doled out money than the one in 1935. In 1935, FDR was forced to move politically more to the left. We're going to talk about why that is. But the WPA, we're going to talk about in a moment. Meanwhile, the National Youth Administration worked to find part-time jobs for young people who were in high school and college. The NYA is an interesting experiment as well. In the South, for instance, all of the NYA administrations were strictly racially segregated, in keeping with Jim Crow at that time, except in Texas. Because in Texas, you had a young 26-year-old NYA director named Lyndon Baines Johnson. And LBJ stressed that financial need was the only requirement for the NYA, and so as a result, a great deal of NYA help in Texas actually went to young people of color living in Texas.
According to the tables which we have assembled, It is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the house. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it. If that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. And that's the program. We're not going.
As radical a departure as the first New Deal was from the norm for many Americans, Americans still wanted more. And as FDR headed toward the middle part of his term in office, his first term in office, Americans demanded more, and they had begun listening to demagogues who promised to redistribute the wealth, who promised almost complete socialism. One of these demagogues was Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana. He called himself the Kingfish, after a character on the Amos and Andy radio show. He was elected governor of Louisiana in 1928 and then to the U.S. Senate in 1932. His motto was a quote from William Jennings Bryan: "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown." And his program was a share the wealth program. I've got a quote here, I've got a sound bite embedded here from Huey Long explaining his program. Long had presidential aspirations, and he really, I think, might have been successful in 1936 in taking the Democratic nomination for the presidency. He was that charismatic. But in the fall of 1935, he was assassinated in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in the Louisiana state capital. But Long, in spite of his flaws, Long, of course, the poor people of Louisiana loved him. He's the first one to pave the roads, provide free school books for children, provide all these services that Louisiana had never had before, build bridges over the Mississippi. And so, despite his corruption and demagoguery, Long was beloved. I've never heard a poor person in Louisiana say anything bad about Huey Long, and I've never heard a rich person in Louisiana say anything good about Huey Long. Nevertheless, pressure put on Franklin Roosevelt by men like Huey Long forced Roosevelt to move to the left politically. And in January of 1935, after the 1934 midterm elections, FDR began passing a more radical New Deal, the Second New Deal. So in the second 100 days in 1935, FDR focused on reform. And there were several major bills that got passed in the second 100 days. And one of them was the Social Security Act of 1935, which for the first time provided old age pensions for Americans, starting at the age of 65. It also set up a system of unemployment compensation and provided direct federal grants to the states on a matching basis for the handicapped as well as needy children. So this is where we get Social Security. You also had the Revenue Act of 1935, which jacked up income tax rates to a top marginal rate of 70%. Of course, whenever that act was passed, Huey Long himself strode around the Senate, thumping other senators on the chest, and said, "I couldn't have said it better myself. I couldn't have written it better myself." So, clearly something to move to the left. Income tax rates after 1935 stayed well above 70% all the way until 1981. Another agency, of course, was the Works Progress Administration, and the WPA provided work relief for American artists, actors, writers. The federal government provided jobs in collecting the testimonies of the few remaining living ex-slaves, in writing travel guides for states, and just a variety of things to keep artists and writers, academics employed as well. And so there were actually some great novels written using WPA money, like All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, the Grapes of Wrath. So a lot of great art and literature that came out of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, while providing Americans work relief during this difficult time. Another part of the Second Hundred Days was the Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act. This act created a National Labor Relations Board and for the first time put the power of the federal government behind labor unions. And one by one, all the major industries in the United States had labor unions that organized. And labor unions and union wages, union jobs, are the cornerstone that built the American middle class after the New Deal. In 1938, the Congress also passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which for the first time established maximum working hours and a minimum wage. So this is where we get the first minimum wage law. And you also had the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA, which provided long-term loans to cooperatives to build electrical co-ops to bring electricity to rural parts of the country. In 1935, 98% of the country's farms did not have electricity. By 1965, 30 years after the passage of the REA, only 2% of American farms did not have electricity. Organized labor, led by John L. Lewis and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, began immediately to use the Wagner Act to extend collective bargaining to the nation's automobile and steel workers. In 1937, U.S. Steel surrendered without a strike, but the United Automobile Workers, it was a tougher task with General Motors. Finally, they developed a strike technique where they simply sat down on the job at UAW plants, and eventually UAW recognized, General Motors recognized the UAW union. And finally, of course, the Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford, who was a very old man at this time, hated unions with a passion. Even Henry Ford, after an intervention by President Roosevelt, got behind labor unions at Ford Motor Company, or at least allowed them to exist. The presidential election of 1936, Democrats re-nominated Franklin Roosevelt, while Republicans nominated Dr. Alfred Landon, Al Landon. And even though some predicted a Landon victory, FDR won in a complete landslide. He had won over the American people with his second New Deal, and FDR was reelected for a second term. This is Dr. Al Landon, the Republican nominee for president in 1936. When FDR assumed office for his second term in 1937, the one thing that still stood in the way of his New Deal was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had struck down important parts of the New Deal, such as the National Industrial Recovery Act administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And so FDR noted that 6 of the 9 justices were over the age of 70, and he came up with a plan, a bill in Congress to pack the Supreme Court. He wanted to appoint one new justice for every justice over the age of 70 because, he said, it was difficult for them to handle their workloads. Well, this plan finally did not go over well with the American people. Congress, in large measure, turned on FDR. The court packing scheme might have succeeded, but it was popular in certain parts of the country. I mean, Lyndon Johnson won election to Congress for the first time, running in support of this court packing scheme in 1937. But Congress turned on FDR. The court packing scheme failed, led to the phrase, "a switch in time saves 9." But it's interesting because the Supreme Court, after this attempt to change the number of justices, all of a sudden got behind the New Deal and began upholding big parts of the New Deal. So, meanwhile, FDR served so long in office that he actually got a chance to appoint quite a few justices of his own, men like Hugo Black, William Douglas, and Felix Frankfurter, because the other justices, as I said, over the age of 70, began to retire or die during the remainder of FDR's terms in office. So even though his court packing scheme failed, ultimately FDR was able to remake the court with these men. Ultimately, the court packing scheme marked the beginning of the end of the New Deal, and the New Deal failed for a variety of reasons. First of all, the court packing scheme turned a number of members of Congress against FDR. In 1938, the administration actually went further and tried to sponsor an anti-lynching bill in Congress to make lynching a federal crime. Senator Tom Connally of Texas led a filibuster in the Senate that killed the anti-lynching bill, and so now FDR had antagonized Southern Democrats with this anti-lynching bill. And then in 1937, FDR believed that the economy had recovered enough that they could slash federal spending and the economy would take over from there. It failed. FDR slashed federal spending and the country went into a serious recession again. Unemployment, which had dropped to 10%, shot back up to 20% in 1937. It was clear by 1938 FDR actively campaigned against members of Congress who had opposed him on the New Deal, and voters re-elected almost all of those who had opposed Roosevelt and defeated almost all of those who supported Roosevelt. And so it was clear that the American people, although they loved FDR in terms of his personality and his person, they simply did not care for the New Deal. Here we have Justices Black, Douglas, and Frankfurter, three of the men that FDR appointed to the Supreme Court who made huge contributions to American jurisprudence during their long terms on the Supreme Court. So how should we evaluate the New Deal? Well, the New Deal temporarily alleviated many conditions of the Great Depression, and in that way it was extraordinarily important because it allowed Americans to psychologically stay alive during the Great Depression, as well as physically. But the New Deal ultimately failed because FDR did not stay the course. He slashed federal spending, and so it did not end the Great Depression. In fact, only increased federal spending far above what the New Deal ever contemplated is what ended the Great Depression during World War II. So they had the right idea, they simply just did not spend enough with the New Deal to fully pull us out of the Great Depression. But the reform measures of the New Deal were also very important in that they laid the foundations for a stable financial system with the Glass-Steagall Act, the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as other measures like Social Security and the National Revenue Act of 1935. So they all laid a firm foundation, financial foundation for the United States for decades to come.